Hello, and welcome back to Space Engineers Automatons.
Beta!
Now, we talked about last time two of the new AI controller blocks, which was the flight controller, this one, that the one that looks like a rocket ship, and the task recorder, these ones that look like diagonal arrows. Now, next thing on the agenda is the event controllers themselves, which are these two blocks here, which are the small grid variants, and then the large grid variants over here, or I say large grid variant. We'll talk about that after we discuss the basics of how the event controller works. So, number one, the main components of the event controller is the condition itself, or rather, I should say, the event that it wants to test. So it pretty much works if you are familiar with programming language. Now, I think for the most part, you will understand what an if else statement is. And that's exactly what this thing does. The event is the condition that the controller wants to test. Like, for example, this one. Does it know, or rather, does it know? It does, I suppose. It knows that if the cockpit is occupied by a pilot or not. So that's what it wants to test. As you can see here on the right side, it displays the status it is currently in. It knows that it's unoccupied, therefore, it will sort of return the statement as false, as you can see here. Action slot 2, or rather, the output says action slot 2. Now, that only makes sense if you go into the second component, which is the select actions. Now, this part here has two, let's say, event, or rather, action slots, I suppose. Now, the game doesn't do a very good job of telling you what exactly they do. Now, a good thing to remember is that the first action slot will only be triggered if the event controller detects that the condition has become true. Now, if it becomes false, on the other hand, it will trigger the second action slot. Okay, following me so far? So, now we've discussed that. The third part is the block parts. See here? Now, once you've set an event, it doesn't matter what it is, whether altitude, angle, cargo field, the event controller will automatically detect on the grid that it's currently attached to, automatically detect which block these events would apply to. Now, in this case, it wants to test for cockpit occupied, so therefore it will find any and all cockpits currently attached to this grid, which is, well, only one that's available, which is the industrial cockpit. Yeah? So, there you have it. Now that you have all three set up, the event, the blocks, and the select actions, let me show you how that actually works. So, we want to test if the cockpit is occupied or not. The action that I've specifically set for this is for this thing to trigger this timer block. Now, you can do this with any other action, actually. You can set that up. Let's go here. You can set this up to trigger any sort of action like, well, you normally would set in your normal toolbar when you go to a cockpit or a control seat or whatever. For our purposes, we want to activate more than a few things at once, and that's where the timer block can be useful. So you don't actually need to set this thing to a timer. You can just make it so that the event forces the timer to trigger immediately. So that's what I've done. See, it immediately sets the timer to trigger now. So what I want to do is that as soon as I enter this cockpit, I want these projectors to turn on, yeah, and then the hinges to start, uh, not rotate, to start flapping back and forth, and for the inertia tensors to turn off on all of these things so that it can, move freely without affecting the thing's momentum. Yeah? So, ready? I will press F onto the cockpit and these things should turn on and start flapping. There we go. See? Fairly straightforward, right? Because it, or rather, because the event controller detects that I am now occupying the cockpit and therefore will trigger the first action or the first slot in the action slot. Okay? Now, as soon as I press F again and exit the cockpit, it will trigger the second action slot, which is the exact opposite of the first thing that I set it to do, which is turn off the projectors, lock the hinges back into place, and turn the inertia tensors back on. Ready? 3, 2, boom. See? That's fairly straightforward. The event controllers function pretty much like an if-else statement if you are familiar with, programming language. It basically detects, is this cockpit occupied or no? If true, then activate these things, or rather any action that you wanted to activate. And if false, then it will trigger a secondary action that you set it to activate. Another example, I've also worked on this connector, right, on my second event controller that is attached to this ship, and that is to tell this thing to, hold on, to do a bunch of things, which will be to turn on all the thrusters and to set the battery off of recharge. Currently, this thing's batteries, I don't know if you can see, it's on yellow, which means it's on recharge. Now, let me just hop into the cockpit, and if I disconnect the connector, because the event controller wants to check if this thing is currently connected, as you can see, if I disconnect this thing, it's going to detect that it is no longer connected, and it will set off the second action here, which will be to turn on my thrusters and put my batteries back on auto. And there. See? Pretty much instant, simultaneous. So that's one way you could, one thing you could do to give the event controllers more than a couple of things to do, which is to use them in conjunction with the timer blocks. Right? Pretty simple. So, same principle. If I connect this thing back, the event controller will detect that the condition that I've set for it is true and turn my thrusters off and set my batteries on recharge at the same time. So it's currently hovered, it's ready to connect. I will press 3 and boom. Thrusters off, batteries on recharge. Now I'm going to exit the cockpit and boom, again. See? Fairly simple and straightforward. Now, this next part is the part that I need the developers of Keen to pay close attention to, because I'm pretty sure that the event controllers are kind of broken right now. Well, I mean, I'll grant that it is the beta and they're sort of expecting people to detect the bugs, but let me just demonstrate. So what I'm specifically referring to is this thing, the end gate. It doesn't work. Well, it kind of works and it doesn't work in certain specific scenarios because, okay, well, I have a confession to make. I haven't actually programmed anything for more than 5 years. Well, it's not exactly true, but let's just say that if I'm wrong, by all means feel free to call me out, but I'm pretty sure it works something like this. So, once the event controller, right, detects a statement, or rather a change, that if you have an event that's sort of goes like this, right? For now, we have a cargo field, and the condition is that if the cargo crosses that threshold, whether it becomes greater than or equal to or less than the threshold that I've set for it, and that threshold specifically referring to the cargo that's currently occupying these cargo containers, and the end gate, what the end gate does is that it makes sure that all the blocks that you've given this thing to test, if both of them pass the condition and says that they're both greater than or equal in terms of the capacity that they have inside them, then and only then will this thing trigger the first action that I've given it. Otherwise, if it's false, or rather either of the cargo containers results in a false output from this thing, meaning if one or both of them reach below the threshold that I've given it, then the second action should trigger. As you can see here, if you're familiar with, I suppose, C++, Visual Basic, Java, actually, it kind of looks like the same thing, regardless of programming language. It will show up like this. If cargo 1, these two, cargo 1 and cargo 2, pay attention to the end, is equal to or greater than 1% capacity, then this thing should toggle the green spotlight, this one, to turn on. Now, if this thing is false, an event triggers that will cause this thing to go false, then the red spotlight would trigger instead. Now, this test only seems to happen when a change happens within the blocks that are being tested that would result in the threshold being crossed, like if it becomes over 1% or becomes lower than 1%, then this statement, then and only then, this statement should be triggered, right? So, if any of that explanation makes sense, let's go ahead and test this right now. So, both of the spotlights are turned off. Now, if I fill this cargo, right, it's got 0, both of them are at 0 right now. If I put this ice onto this cargo, even if I manage to, put enough ice on this thing to make it go over the 1%, then the event should not trigger as true. It is currently in the false state right now, technically speaking, right? If I do this, well, in, let's say, 1,000 on this first cargo container, nothing should change, right? Because it's still false. Technically, this one is true. It's reached over 1%, but since I have the end gate toggle turned on, it will not register as true or trigger as true until the second cargo container also goes over the 1% threshold. So if we fill this thing with over 1% of cargo, the first spotlight should turn on, or rather the true spotlight should turn on, because both of these cargo containers now fulfill the condition of being over 1%. Therefore, the event should trigger as true because we have the end gate turned on. Okay, so all good so far. Now, if we make this false, trigger a change that would cause the thing, or at least one of these cargo containers, to go below the threshold, the second spotlight should toggle on because it has now become false. So let's go and take off the cargo container, the second cargo container's contents, and boom. See? All working as intended so far, right? Right? Now, I think if I have this correctly, since it is currently in the false state right now, and I've demonstrated this the first time I've made a change, it started off in the false state, and when I added cargo, or rather contents, to this thing, to the first cargo, it still remained false, and therefore the second spotlight did not trigger. However, if I remove this, technically the condition would have gone from false into false. Therefore, it should not trigger. Rather, it should not trigger the event because it did not cross the threshold. Unfortunately, if I do this, you see the problem? The red spotlight triggered or toggled off. It should not have done that. I think. I'm not entirely sure if that's what Keen intended, but doesn't make a lot of sense because by that logic, if we make this change again, technically it's in the false state right now. If we add ice to this again, it will remain false and the red spotlight should not trigger, so, right? As expected. But if you go from false to false, again, the problem, false to false, doesn't trigger. False to false, triggers. That seems like an inconsistency to me, right? So you might be wondering, what if both statements are true, right? So we make these both, we make both conditions true, and therefore the true spotlight, the green spotlight, should trigger. Makes sense. So if we do the same thing and go from true to a true condition, like we change up the contents of these things so that it still remains true, the green spotlight should not trigger, and it does not. See? It's consistent in every other scenario except for the part where it goes from untrue, or rather false, into false, but the cargo containers get emptied. So if I take this off, that should trigger. Makes sense. That's what you would expect. But when I take this off, it will trigger again, which is not what you would expect. So I don't have a lot of subscribers, and I doubt that Keen would pay any attention to this unless I suppose I post this on the Reddit or Discord. I'm not entirely sure if those exist. This seems like an inconsistency to me, and Keen needs to take a look at this. And I don't think it would serve me to test any other functions with this thing, at least not the kinds of things that I would find particularly useful or practical, because the end gate doesn't function as intended. Yeah, although granted, I haven't tested the other conditions that I could possibly set this thing to, but this is the one I have found so far within the limited amount of time that I am able to test this thing. But still, it's a pretty egregious, at least for me, pretty egregious flaw, and I think he needs to work on that. So that's all for now. Until next time, hopefully he manages to fix this thing by the time that the actual official patch comes out with the DLC. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye.